As for the minority that may have fallen for Hamas's con's job, I suggest you listen to Colonel John Spencer. John Spencer is head of urban warfare studies at West Point. He studied every major urban conflict. I was going to say in modern history. He corrected me, no, in history. Israel, he said, has implemented more precautions to prevent civilian harm than any military in history and beyond what international law requires.
That was the voice of Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaking in July in Washington, where he was asking the U.S. Congress for more support for Israel's 10-month-old war in Gaza. As you heard, Bibi name-dropped John Spencer, a retired American Army officer who's now one of the world's most well-known experts in urban warfare, and that includes tunnels. The two men met when Spencer was on a research trip to Israel this winter. They sat down for a half-hour interview. Although Spencer says he's not an official advisor, he has been embedded with the IDF in Gaza 3 times so far this war, and he's been taken into some of the liberated tunnels. After a 25-year army career, including 2 tours of Iraq, he's unapologetically pro-Israel. He frequently appears on news shows like CNN to defend the Israeli army. He believes Hamas is lying about how many Palestinians have been killed. He says there's no genocide in Gaza, and he insists the IDF is acting more humanely to save civilian lives than any other army would behave in this situation, to please the international community. And yes, despite the weekend heartbreak, when IDF soldiers discovered the bodies of 6 Israeli hostages executed in a tunnel under Rafah, Spencer believes Israel is actually winning the war, although it'll take a long time once the fighting ends until it's actually over.
The ultimate win is that Hamas never rules again. You have to put in another power. There are many ways to do that. You have to start post-conflict operations like de-radicalization programs, reconstruction, new governance institutions, all this stuff, which is very common in war. But it will take a very, very long time.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Thursday, September the 4th, 2024. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News.
Y'all remember that joke from Airplane? The old lady asked for some light reading.
How about this leaflet, famous Jewish sports legends?
But in actuality, that's changing. Jews are crushing it in sports around the world, and we are here to celebrate them.
Sandy Koufax gets his 10th strikeout.
Zach Hyman, his first career hat trick. 41 points for Diddy Avdia. It's Sue Bird's building.
I'm Gabe.
And I'm Jamie.
We love Jews and we love sports, but most of all, we love kvelling over Jews in sports.
Together we host Menschwarmers, the longest-running Jewish sports podcast in the world. Listen and subscribe at thecjn.ca and wherever you find your podcasts.
On Wednesday, the IDF released a short video showing a brightly painted room inside the ruins of a Palestinian house. The room was whitewashed with a mural of Mickey Mouse, and the soldiers also found stuffed animals and drawings. And somewhere in that room, they say, although you can't see it, is where the tunnel shaft was where the bodies of the 6 murdered Israeli hostages were discovered.
As you can see, this tunnel was hidden in a child's bedroom, a place where a child should be safe, and not used as a human shield for Hamas.
None of this surprises retired Major John Spencer. While the American commentator couldn't say precisely where that tunnel is located, he's seen enough of the underground network that Hamas built up in the past 15 years in Gaza to know what it smells like, what it feels like to move through them, and what risks these tunnels pose both to the hostages and also to the IDF soldiers sent in to find them. Spencer will be coming to Canada to speak at 2 events, one in Winnipeg on September 11th and in Toronto the next night on September 12th. It's his first official visit to Canada, arranged by Tough Sikh and some other pro-Israel groups with the support of Winnipeg's Jewish Federation and the Israeli Consulate. Just ahead of his talks, John Spencer joins me. He takes us inside those tunnels and shares his prediction for how long the war will last.
Thanks for having me.
Can you just give our listeners a bit of a background on what role, if any, you are playing officially or unofficially advising the Israeli government in this war?
Sure. So I'm playing absolutely no official or unofficial role, but my research in my writings have been used significantly to fight the disinformation. I have done multiple visits to Israel and 3 visits into Gaza with the IDF since October 7th, which has informed my writing and research. But no official or unofficial role, but my research has been, to include by the prime minister many, many times, been used as to fight the disinformation about what the IDF are actually doing in Gaza to pursue the political objectives provided by the government for the war against Hamas.
We're interviewing you just a few days after the bodies of the 6 Israeli executed hostages were discovered in a 20-meter deep tunnel under Rafah. What can you tell us about this particular tunnel, the depth, and what is significant about it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of unknowns about it, but we know that it was in conjunction to the IDF's recent discovery of a living hostage in a tunnel. But without knowing, nearby, Hamas saw and heard the IDF, and then entered another tunnel without the IDF's knowledge, basically in very close proximity. And because of that IDF operation, believed that Hamas entered their deep tunnel that they were holding the hostages and brutally murdered each one of those 6 hostages. Then we saw the release of the videos that were very recently filmed. We don't know if that was filmed in the tunnel, but we do know where the bodies were found was in this 20-meter deep tunnel in Rafah, which does pain a lot of people because of the different delays in the Rafah operation to basically search and clear the areas in which now where this all occurred.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about that. You've been in the tunnels. When you went, tell us what you saw. Where did you go?
My first visit in December, I actually was taken to the massive tunnel outside of the res humanitarian zone that was discovered. So this is a 2.5-mile tunnel that went 100 feet underground. It was a massive invasion tunnel that you could drive trucks through that had advanced wiring, ventilation, power, telecommunications, a multi-million-dollar tunnel that went right up to the Israeli Gaza wall. It wasn't used on October 7th, but the discovery is just massive. And then it went all the way back into the Gaza, into the urban areas, and had many branches. For me, as somebody who studies underground warfare, just the sophistication of this and the realization this is just one of hundreds of massive tunnels that they have found. And this is just really realization of this underground world that Hamas built, 400 plus miles of tunnels in Gaza, costing billions of dollars, unmeasurable amounts of concrete and steel to build this infrastructure underground for the sole purpose of terror. No civilians are allowed in this. When I went back in February, I went with the IDF, the 98th Division, into Khan Yunis, really going through all they're doing to protect civilians, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but also in just how hard it is to find the tunnels. That one of the places I went with the division commander was where they had intelligence that there was a tunnel, but you just couldn't see it standing on the surface. And actually they were doing their procedures to drill and look for the tunnel that was coming out of Hamas. And they found that tunnel. So I was basically standing on top of a enemy tunnel that was deep underground. When I went back in July and I went into the Netzrim corridor with the IDF, this area where they're creating a corridor, not just a road, from Israel all the way to the Mediterranean through Gaza to create this security zone, a realization and seeing on the maps of how many tunnels were just in the corridor. Basically, that you can't take a step in Gaza without actually having some belief that there's a tunnel underneath you. I also learned there are different types of tunnels in Gaza, and that's really, as you were kind of wrestling with, well, how many tunnels, how many tunnels has the IDF destroyed? Is that each tunnel, isn't, there are levels of tunnels, from strategic ones, which really, like that one I was in December, that isn't for invasion, for large movements, or there are ones that actually connect northern Gaza to southern Gaza, which we didn't, most people didn't know. They're actually in the Netzrim corridor. This is in the area of the Wadi Gaza, right, which is this river basin that splits northern Gaza and southern Gaza. It used to be a river, but it isn't anymore. They've discovered over a mile long, 2 mile long tunnels that go underneath that river basin. So something they just didn't think was possible. So you can basically enter northern Gaza, at the very tip of Gaza, and come out in Rafah, basically in tunnel in some ways. And those are strategic tunnels, but there are also little tactical tunnels that go from one building to another. There are tunnels that are used for command and control. Like in Khan Yunis, they found luxury tunnels for the leadership of Hamas with air conditioners and ceilings and kitchens and barracks. These different types of tunnels, and then making a decision on which ones are critical to military capabilities that have to be destroyed, which is really getting to, well, can you ever really destroy all these? But
what are the challenges for the IDF in this kind of warfare from, let's say, the equipment that doesn't work, that would above ground, things like that?
Yeah, when you enter the underground, it's more like going underwater. You can't breathe without assistance underground, and all the contaminants that are underground is very dangerous for just breathing. You can't see for military personnel. None of your night vision goggles normal work, because usually night vision relies on ambient light, and this is a no light area. You can't communicate because most communication equipment relies on line of sight or satellites. So you can't communicate underground. You can't navigate. So GPS, all of that doesn't work. You can't even shoot your weapons because of the concussion of your weapon. So you have to have all specialized equipment designed only for the underground. Now, unique to Israel is they developed a special unit, the Yahalom, an entire brigade of special forces engineers who try to develop the equipment. So all the drones and robots, and that was also the quick realization is that, yes, you have this specialized unit, soldiers, equipment, everything, but it's nowhere near the amount that you'll need for the size of the tunnels in Gaza.
You said Israel can't see. They have to, some of their stuff that works doesn't work. But in terms of for Hamas, I read somewhere recently that there's sort of a operations manual that was recently discovered, that they have to switch them out because they can't be in the dark. It's bad for their mental health. What do you know about the sort of psychological and physical challenges for the Israelis as well, and of course our hostages?
Being sensory deprived, basically. So when you enter a tunnel, you're being sensory deprived. As a matter of fact, not all soldiers can operate underground. You get things like vertigo, you get claustrophobia. Just for the breathing, you start to get breathing problems, right? Because even if you have ventilation, which many of these do, there's still immense amounts of contaminants. If from going to the bathroom down there, it's foreign for the human body. So all of those start to come into play. So you can't spend your life underground without ever coming to the surface. So they rotate them because of that psychological impact of being sensory deprived, the contaminants in the air, all really human functions that you're dealing with down there. You can lose a sense of time. I mean, we kind of know that you kind of need vitamin D every once in a while, so you need the sunlight. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why it's really bad. So for me, it reckons the understanding that the hostages have been held, many of them, although some of them have been held in civilian apartments and doctors' apartments and things like that, are being held in this place that's really unhealthy, inhumane, unsanitary for humans to live in. So for Hamas, which I don't really care about, yeah, it's bad for them to stay underground for a long time, and if they're rotated, it may help with that.
Okay, and you were mentioning about the fact that IDF's being pilloried for not being humanitarian enough in its military operations. Why do you feel that the world is not giving Israel a fair shake?
Well, at the macro level, it seems for Israel, Gaza is where the truth dies. The accusation that Israel has been disproportionate, indiscriminate, excessive, or starving the population, while none of those are true, there's actually a counterfactual, huge body of evidence, actual real and physical, like the starvation. I went to the Netzarim corridor, saw where the pier used to be, and there was just mountains, a whole field of humanitarian aid that just hadn't been picked up. But from the actual execution of war, like you said, for the IDF, no, there's no comparison, right? So the IDF was being compared to other operations where just this tunnel challenge of being able to find and operate with an entire world underneath the urban areas. So Hamas built this world underneath their civilians for the sole purpose of using everything on the surface to cause the international community. So the destruction, the civilian casualties, everything. And then the other thing, which is what the prime minister and other Israeli officials or government use, which is in this execution of this war against Hamas, right? So a defender who's had 15 years to prepare for the attack of the IDF. Israel has done more, as in implemented more civilian harm mitigation measures than any military in the history of war, to include the US, Canada, like the coalitions, to prevent civilian casualties and destructions, like evacuating cities, like the use of daily pauses, the use of certain munitions. Like there's a long list that I go through. There's actually over 10 civilian harm mitigation measures that Israel has implemented, some that have never been created before in the history of war, like tracking civilian populations with their cell phones on or off, and then restricting, and this is what I saw in Khan Yunis, restricting the IDF operations because of that overriding aspect of preventing civilian harm, trying to get the civilians out of harm's way. The IDF had to find a way to create a safer zone within Gaza while still moving against Hamas.
Some people have criticized that, your view, saying, well, it's hard for them to be humanitarian when they're trapped or their cell phones aren't working. I just wanted to raise the point that some people wouldn't agree. In terms of where Yahya Sinwar is, if there any evidence that he's still in a tunnel somewhere?
I do only unclassified. There's, I guess, no direct evidence. I think from all rational, reasonable analysis, that is the belief that he's there, and what he would lose if he left, just from a a war objective stance, just for the fact that Israel was able to take out Mohammed Def, who was considered like the ghost of Hamas, right? The original founder of Hamas's military. I think it's highly likely that the IDF have a really good idea where he's at in Gaza, but that he has surrounded himself with hostages, and that he's likely surrounded himself with tens of thousands of Palestinians in the areas in which Israel has had to create these safer zones that Hamas has since day one used for their advantages, to include firing rockets from within. Mohammed Def was within stone's throw of the humanitarian zone. So yes, I believe that Israel has a really good idea of the general area, but also there is a realization this is, although it's a small area, right? The Gaza Strip, 25 miles long, 7 to 5 miles wide in its longest area. 2 million people. It is, for one person to hide, there's rumors of him dressing up like a woman, things like that, to hide and move within the tunnels. There's one video of him and his family, which is interesting because it's the only civilians ever allowed in the tunnels, moving through the tunnels of Khan Yunis back in the beginning of the war. I think he's there mostly underground for most of the time, like a rat, but that he's also within this area of hundreds of thousands of civilians. It would be really hard to know exactly where he's at.
I want to ask, is Israel actually winning this war?
So yeah, I wrote a foreign affairs article encountering actually like 4 major articles that have been published that Israel isn't winning. It's actually creating more terrorists than it's killing. All these wrong frameworks. So I wrote this article that Israel absolutely is winning its war against Hamas in Gaza. I taught strategy at West Point. Wars have a start, they have an end. They have political goals, which can change, although Israel hasn't changed its 3 primary goals. Those are, number 1, return the hostages. Number 2, destroy Hamas, its political and military power in the Gaza Strip. And number 3, secure the borders. Now, it's especially with the hostages, the idea of, okay, they brought home over half the hostages, to include over 100 living hostages. But the ideal there is that the myth that Israel could have brought them home a different way, it could have negotiated in the beginning, it could have done it without military force, is just not reality. And I go through that in this foreign affairs article, that it's been a combination of diplomatic, military, and other forms of national power that have brought over half the hostages home.
But in terms of safety, so
Yep.
is Israel's border with Gaza safer now? We're not even talking about Hezbollah because that's a whole other thing, and the West Bank, we don't have time.
The whole security framework that was before October 7th will not ever be happen again. The reliance on only technologies, minimal forces, the wall, everything. So Israel is building a buffer zone of up to a kilometer from where the wall was. It's created more corridors through Gaza, which will allow it to project power. It's secured, which is vital, the southern border between Gaza and Egypt, and eliminated the superhighway that we now know was there for underground smuggling of weapons, weapons, equipment, financing, everything. It's sealed that. So just from an overall sense of securing southern Israel from Gaza and the threats of Gaza, it's massive engineering projects, both creating the buffer zone all the way around, eliminating all the tunnels that were there, creating the Netzarim corridor. There's new entry points into Gaza that will allow for this new security framework to be in place.
Our listeners may have started to hear the words Philadelphia corridor. It's the sort of border, help me here, between Gaza and Egypt, which Israel withdrew from in its agreement to disengage from Gaza years ago. And then they've reoccupied it because Egypt was allowing, as you said, all these smuggling to go through. And that's been a big flashpoint. So let's talk about why that's so important now in what happens next.
Sure. In order to destroy Hamas, which is not the idea of Hamas, but the military power and the political power of Hamas, what Israel has done along this border between Gaza and Egypt, which is only like an 8 to 10 mile stretch of land, but they have moved in, secured it, and cut off the bloodline to Hamas. All of that resupplied, rockets, everything, even financing. Now, the contention is how long does Israel need to hold that piece of ground? And does it always need to have forces there, physically there, securing it? I personally believe not so, right? The Israel-Gaza wall, the border wall between Israel and Gaza actually worked. It has a very deep subterranean aspect to it with a bunch of advanced sensors. So Egypt was talking about that before it was actually discovered that there's over 100 massive tunnels going between Egypt and Gaza, to include ones you can drive giant trucks through. Eventually, I think there will be basically an Israeli-style wall there that will prevent that subterranean traffic. Because on the surface, you can use advanced technologies, although you don't rely only on that. And Egypt did send a division of armor, basically an armor brigade, to the border early in the war, and put up a new wall to because they also didn't want anybody coming across their border. So it's possible, but in the now, as why is this such a big issue for Hamas? Why is like Hamas saying you will not get any hostages back unless you leave the Philadelphia corridor? Because it's their vital aspect of surviving. Because in my article, again, all they have to do to win this war is survive. They have ideas on how to do that, and they're grasping. And this corridor, this highway for them is very vital, of course, to their survival, to be able to bring more weapons in, to be able to get out, all these things. But they also have ideas on still like, okay, fine, I'll give up political power. I call this the Hezbollah model. Hamas has put forward a plan to bring in some technocrats to govern Gaza, but they maintain military power. Sounds a lot like Hezbollah in Lebanon, although Hezbollah is also part of the government. So they're grasping at trying to survive the war and basically win. And Israel has said that that's not going to happen. We're going to demilitarize the strip. We're going to actually start de-radicalization programs. We're going to secure the entire border around so that Hamas can't survive.
So finally, how long is this going to take? And can Israel actually win, or this is going to happen again?
So I got this actually in October. How long will this take? How long will it take to clear the urban areas of Hamas's military capabilities, tunnels, infrastructure? I mean, they found deep buried weapons manufacturing plants that just nobody knew that were there, that it was possible to do that. I always said, well, it isn't how much time it will take, how much time do they have? Eisenhower, after World War II, the very public newspaper article said it would take 50 years to re-educate the Nazis. And if you ever thought we were going to give them the ability to wage war again, you were crazy. How long will it take to demilitarize the Gaza Strip? A very long time. How long will it take to de-radicalize Hamas? But there is a path, right? So I say it is up to Israel's winning, but it's up to Israel it's a democratic country. It's up to Israel if it ultimately wins, because very common in war, you have to bring in another power. Like you can demilitarize and you can degrade Hamas to where it's this guerrilla force, which Israel is very close. Like Hamas doesn't have military capability. It's a guerrilla force hiding in the shadows, governing from the shadows, using humanitarian aid as coercive power over the people. But Israel has to basically help and put in a new power that will be the ultimate win. And Israel has to, for their survival, the Israeli people especially have to understand that.
Canada stopped exporting arms permits to Israel back in January. Are they being hurt by this?
I'm sure it absolutely is a problem, because it might not be what Canada is providing, but it's in the international context that sends a signal to other allies. I mean, Israel's strength is its allies in all wars. So when one ally of Israel says, because of these lies, this misinformation, we're not going to support you with this small item, which might not have an immediate impact, but globally, in the international context, to include in the region with Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, it matters. So it's a horrible signal to send to the world and to send to Israel. And on the immediate impacts, maybe less, but it doesn't help when it's based on.
And then Britain just did it too.
Yeah, Britain did it too. It's very bad because it's baseless. It's based on disinformation. It's based on things like 40,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza, which is not true. It's a lie. That's the huge myth of this war, is that there was another way to bring the hostages home, to remove Hamas from power so it can't do on October 7th. Because since October 7th, they have publicly said, that's our goal. We're going to do this as many times as it takes to achieve our goal. So these are huge topics, but that whole, the truth dies in Gaza has many factions, but especially the number of civilian casualties, which is used as the overwhelming evidence of Israel's actions, which is not true, and it's actually a fallacy.
Okay, we could be doing this for 2 hours, but then no one would have to come listen to you. So we're going to stop, and I'm going to thank you very, very much for spending this time with us here at the CJN Daily, and we wish you a successful cross-Canada trip.
Thank you so much.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News. We've put links to John Spencer's website in our show notes, plus some links where you can buy tickets for his lectures. Our show's produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman. The executive producer is Michael Freeman, and our music is by Dov Beck-Levine. Thanks for listening to the CJN Daily.